The sun hadn't yet broken over Rome's 7 hills when the exhausted witnesses emerged from their shadowed posts. February 3rd, 1502. The air carried the scratch of quills against parchment, documenting what no holy scripture ever intended to record. Inside the bedchamber, Lucrezia Borgia had just endured something that would redefine the very concept of political marriage. 3 times, carefully observed, meticulously documented. This wasn't debauchery. This was politics at its most calculated, where a 13-year-old girl's body became the battlefield for European supremacy. But how did the daughter of the Pope become the most politically valuable virgin in Christendom? And why did her consummation require witnesses from 3 different kingdoms? This is the story of how marriage became warfare, how papal power corrupted sacred vows, and how one girl's wedding night changed the course of European history. Before we dive into this tale of political horror disguised as holy matrimony, I want you to understand what you're about to discover. What you're going to learn about Renaissance marriage politics will challenge everything you thought you knew about papal power. We think of marriage as a choice made by adults in love, but in 1502 marriage was a military alliance sealed with a child's body, and the Pope's daughter was the ultimate prize. Picture this. You are standing in the papal apartments in 1480, watching a 9-year-old girl who doesn't yet know she will never belong to herself. Her father, Pope Alexander VI, understood something that would define his daughter's entire existence. In Renaissance politics, a papal daughter's virginity was more valuable than the papal treasury itself. Here's what Alexander VI grasped about power that his more pious predecessors had missed. Marriage wasn't a sacrament when you controlled the church. It was a renewable contract with European kingdoms. Lucrezia's education wasn't in Latin or theology. She learned the currency of her worth, bloodline, virginity, and the ability to bear legitimate heirs for whatever kingdom bid highest for papal favor. 1491, age 11. Lucrezia's first engagement to the son of Spanish nobility. The contract specified consummation protocols, dowry payments, and most chillingly, verification procedures for her virginity. But European politics shifted faster than papal patience. When Spain's support became uncertain, Alexander VI simply annulled an engagement that had never been consummated. Lucrezia learned her first lesson. She was merchandise that could be returned. 1493. The second engagement. This time to Giovanni Sforza, Lord of Pesaro. Not love, not even political preference, pure geographic strategy. Alexander VI needed the Sforza military alliance against French invasion. Giovanni Sforza was 27 years old, experienced in both warfare and bedroom politics. Lucrezia was 13, with the political experience of a chess piece. The marriage contract wasn't about love, it was a military treaty disguised as matrimony. The Sforza family gained papal protection, Alexander VI gained access to northern Italian military networks. But here's where the horror truly begins. The contract included specific requirements for public consummation verification, not just marriage. Proof of sexual completion that would satisfy 3 different courts. Lucrezia's preparation wasn't bridal, it was procedural. Vatican officials explained her duties not as a wife, but as a political instrument whose body would seal international agreements. June 12, 1493. Representatives from Spain, France, and the Holy Roman Empire arrived in Rome. They weren't wedding guests, they were witnesses to a political transaction. The wedding ceremony itself was a masterpiece of papal theatre. Alexander VI presiding over his daughter's marriage, blessing a union that everyone present knew was purely transactional. Lucrezia stood in cloth of gold, jewels worth more than most kingdoms' annual revenues adorning her 13-year-old frame. She wasn't a bride, she was a diplomatic gift wrapped in papal blessing. The guest list read like a roster of European intelligence, ambassadors whose job was to report every detail back to their sovereigns, Vatican officials documenting the alliance, Sforza representative ensuring their family's investment was properly secured. But the ceremony was merely prologue. What happened after sunset would create diplomatic documentation so explicit that Vatican archives would hide it for centuries. The bridal chamber wasn't prepared for romance. It was arranged for verification, positions for witnesses, documentation stations for scribes, medical examination areas for post-consummation confirmation. Imagine standing in the Vatican corridors as night falls on June 12, 1493. You're watching the assembly of witnesses for what should be a private moment between newlyweds. The Spanish ambassador, Don Diego López de Haro, carried specific instructions from Queen Isabella: document everything. Spain needed proof that this alliance was properly consummated to justify future military cooperation. The French representative Cardinal d'Estouteville had opposite motivations. France wanted this alliance to fail, so his documentation would search for any technicality to invalidate the marriage later. Vatican officials represented the Church's interest in canonical validity, not spiritual concerns, political ones. This marriage had to be unquestionably legitimate for future papal Sforza agreements. Dr. Gaspar Torella, Alexander VI's personal physician, carried instruments that no wedding should require. His job, medical verification of consummation completion. The protocol was methodical, clinical, and designed to eliminate any future dispute about the marriage's validity. 3 separate verification procedures, multiple witnesses for each, documentation in 3 languages. 10 p.m. The first act of this political theatre begins. Not romance, but performance art designed to satisfy Spanish diplomatic requirements. Giovanni Sforza understood his role perfectly. This wasn't about his wife's comfort or pleasure. It was about demonstrating completion of a political contract to Spanish satisfaction. Lucrezia's terror was documented by the Spanish scribe. The young lady wept but understood her duty to Holy Church and Spanish alliance. The Spanish verification required direct observation of penetration, completion, and evidence of virginity lost, not witnessed from a distance, examined up close by men whose job was political documentation. Dr. Torella's examination following the first consummation was described in medical Latin that couldn't disguise the horror, a 13-year-old girl being clinically verified for Spanish political satisfaction. But Spanish satisfaction wasn't enough. The French required their own verification process, and their standards were designed to be even more intrusive. Midnight. Cardinal d'Estouteville arrived with French verification protocols that would make the Spanish procedures seem merciful by comparison. French law required not just consummation but evidence of female participation and satisfaction. Their concern wasn't protecting Lucrezia, it was ensuring the marriage could never be annulled for non-consummation. By this point, Lucrezia's condition was documented as extremely distressed but compliant with papal directive. She was no longer a person, she was a diplomatic function being performed. The French medical requirements went beyond Spanish standards, not just evidence of penetration, but documentation of physical response, duration and completion from both parties. But the most brutal was yet to come. The Holy Roman Empire's requirements weren't just about consummation, they were about demonstrating papal authority over imperial marriage politics. 2 a.m. The imperial verification wasn't just about marriage validity, it was about demonstrating that papal authority superseded imperial marriage laws. The imperial protocol required the most degrading positions, the most invasive documentation, and the most public confirmation of papal power over European marriage politics. Lucrezia's final documented words that night, "I serve Holy Church and my Father's will." She had been psychologically broken into complete political compliance. Dr. Torella's final report satisfied all 3 courts. Consummation was complete, the marriage was unquestionably valid, and papal authority over European alliance building was definitively established. As dawn broke over Rome on February 4, 1502, 3 sets of diplomatic pouches carried documentation that would reshape European marriage politics for generations. Within 2 weeks, every major court in Europe had received detailed documentation of Lucrezia Borgia's triple consummation. The reaction wasn't moral outrage, it was political calculation. Queen Isabella's response was coldly practical. The papal alliance is secured through proper consummation. Spanish interests in Italy are now guaranteed through unquestionable marriage validity. King Charles VIII of France saw opportunity in the horror. If this is how the Pope treats his own daughter, imagine what he'll do to his enemies. We must prepare for total war. Emperor Maximilian I established new imperial marriage verification requirements based on the Borgia precedent. Political consummation became standard diplomatic practice. Legal scholars across Europe began codifying Borgia standards for political marriage verification. What had been an abomination became institutional practice. But we need to rewind to understand what the triple consummation did to Lucrezia herself. The girl who entered that bedchamber was not the woman who emerged. Here's what Lucrezia understood about herself after that night. If she was going to be used as a political weapon, she would learn to wield that weapon herself. Within 6 months, Lucrezia was conducting secret negotiations with French agents, using her marriage's validity as leverage against her own father's Spanish alliance. She learned to use Giovanni Sforza's guilt over their wedding night against him, gaining unprecedented control over Sforza military decisions through psychological manipulation. Alexander VI began to realize he had created something dangerous. a daughter who understood exactly how political marriage worked and could use that knowledge against him. 1497. 4 years after the triple consummation that had horrified Europe, Alexander VI needed to destroy the marriage he had so publicly validated. But how do you annul a marriage that was verified by 3 courts, documented by multiple witnesses, and medically confirmed beyond any possible dispute? The solution was breathtakingly cynical. Giovanni Sforza was forced to publicly declare himself impotent, making their marriage legally unconsummated despite the documented evidence. European diplomats were stunned by the audacity. The same pope who had forced triple verification was now claiming the marriage had never been consummated at all. But Lucrezia had learned from her first marriage's horror. Her second marriage negotiations included specific protections, private verification, and her own choice of witnesses. The girl who had been politically raped in the name of papal alliance had become one of Europe's most sophisticated political operators. The most horrifying consequence of Lucrezia's wedding night wasn't personal, it was institutional. What Alexander VI had done to his daughter became standard practice across European nobility. By 1500, verified consummation was standard for any marriage involving succession rights, territorial claims, or military alliances. Lucrezia's trauma had normalized political rape. Legal scholars created detailed protocols for marriage verification, complete with witness requirements, medical examinations, and documentation standards. The bureaucratization of sexual abuse. Hundreds of young women across Europe would endure variations of Lucrezia's wedding night over the following decades. Her suffering had created a template for institutional brutality. 1517. When Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses, one of his most powerful arguments wasn't theological, it was Lucrezia Borgia's wedding night. Protestant reformers didn't need to fabricate papal corruption. They simply quoted the documented verification procedures from Alexander VI's archives. How do you maintain papal moral authority when everyone knows the Pope forced his 13-year-old daughter through 3 consummations while diplomats watched? The Counter-Reformation's marriage reforms were, in many ways, a direct response to the Borgia precedent. The Church had to prove it could protect rather than exploit women. Look at any modern institutional abuse scandal, and you'll see the same pattern: individual trauma becoming systematic practice, power structures protecting themselves rather than victims, documentation used to enable rather than prevent abuse. We return now to that bedchamber in the Vatican, where a 13-year-old girl's body became the signature on a political treaty. Lucrezia Borgia survived her father, outlived her trauma, and ultimately wielded more political power than most kings. But she paid a price no child should ever pay for adult ambitions. Her story isn't just about one horrific wedding night, it's about what happens when institutions prioritize power over protection, when political necessity overrides human dignity. Today we consider marriage a choice made by consenting adults, but Lucrezia's story reminds us how recently that wasn't true, and how vigilant we must remain to protect that progress. The legacy of that February night in 1502 echoes through history. Absolute power corrupts absolutely, and the most vulnerable always pay the highest price for political ambition.